Cheech Chong is known as the master of stoner comedy, with their hazy jokes and great on-screen chemistry. But there's a world of strange turns and awkward starts behind the bong jokes and cult great movies. We are only beginning to scratch the surface, though, as most people don't know about a lot more. This is the true story that shows two people can make something magical together even if they don't get along at first. Wait until the end, because the last few facts will shock you the most. Let's start how they got together. The story of how Cheech and Chong met is one of those amazing real-life events that almost seems too strange to be true. And the fact that their amazing comedy journey that spanned decades began in a Vancouver bar with no top, that just makes it more strangely brilliant. You must have heard that most comic pairs either grew up on the same block or became friends over schoolyard jokes, right? But not these two. Before fate put Richard Cheich, Marin, and Tommy Chong in the same smoky room and then on the same stage, their lives couldn't have been more different. So, Cheich wasn't really getting ready for a life full of pot jokes and punchlines. Comedic stuff wasn't even on his mind. Cheich was born in South Los Angeles to a police officer father. His life had gone in a very different direction. He learned how to make pottery. He went to California State University, Northridge, because he wanted to learn how to use clay wheels and kilns, not get standing ovations. But things were crazy in the late 1960s, especially for young American guys. Every choice was weighed against the draft for the Vietnam War. Because of this, Cheich made a brave choice when he was told he might have to go fight a war he didn't believe in. He ran away to Canada. He would say in the end, "I didn't want to get killed in Vietnam." He didn't choose to avoid the draft, but it put him in Vancouver at the right time, even though he didn't know it yet. You might think that Chong and Chin were just two stupid stoners who got lucky. Not so fast. Their real story keeps getting stranger and stranger. Hold on until the end. First, it's the kind of thing that no one ever talks about. Not having a clear plan for living in a new place wasn't easy. Cheich worked any job he could find to make money. He drove a truck. He took out the carpets. His clay work didn't stop at any point. It was hard for him to plan his life. He kept going, though. He then went to a nearby club one night to look for any kind of work that would keep him going. And that's where his fate was waiting for him, even though it probably didn't look very exciting at first. Tommy Chong was on the other end of this funny birth story. Tommy's own life had already been very interesting. His father was Chinese and his mother was Scottish-Irish. He was born in Edmonton, Alberta. Not as a comedian, but as a singer, he had already had a taste of fame. In the past, he played guitar in a band called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. Motown actually signed them. That could have been its own story, right? However, Tommy stopped being in music in the 1970s and began a different type of business. He ran a bar without a roof in Vancouver's Chinatown. It was called the Shanghai Junk, but Tommy wasn't content to run any old topless bar. He wasn't interested in that. So he mixed performance art with burlesque, making the Shanghai Junk something between a strip club and a comedy theater. His art group was called City Works. In between the dancers' moves, they would do short comedic acts. That's a pretty strange mix, right? But it worked in some way. Tommy liked to try new things and push the limits, and this setup let him do both. He went to the Shanghai Junk one night in 1970 just looking for work. Anything. His goal wasn't to be funny. He only had rent to pay. He looked at Cheich and asked himself, why not? There was something about him that made sense. It could have been his vibe, his energy, or the way he timed things. In any case, Tommy asked him to join the comedy group, which is where the magic began. It was clear that they were attracted to each other, but at first neither of them knew what they had found. They began to riff off of each other during a show one night, and ended up in a bit about a man looking for his friend Dave. The other guy was so high that he kept saying, "Dave's not here." It wasn't planned. They didn't practice it. It happened right now, but the crowd went crazy. Later, Tommy would say it was all an accident. But aren't the best things in life sometimes accidents? That one act, which came about out of the blue, was their first big hit and showed them what they could do when they worked together. They saw that they were funny together, not just separately. That doesn't happen very often. So they kept playing together every night, and over time, their act changed. The guy who looked like he lived in a cloud of smoke was played by Tommy. Chi, who was smart and full of energy, talked quickly and was called Alec. They were both great at playing their roles. Seeing both sides of the same stoner coin was interesting. As word spread about them in Vancouver, it became clear that they were unique. After only a few months, they chose to quit the club and go on the road as a comedy duo. They were known as Cheech and Chong. From then on, they were always linked with radical comedy. What they were writing was risky, sarcastic, and nothing like what anyone else was writing at the time. They were not just joking, they were getting into the minds of a whole generation. One guy was trying to avoid the draft, and the other was putting on a comedy show in a bar with no roof. Who would have thought? From there, their popularity went through the roof. After putting out records and going on tours across the U.S., they made movies that became cult classics. But the main point of their story never changed, even as they became more famous. There were always two very different people who met in the strangest place and made everyone laugh in a new way. In other news, you won't believe that things weren't always as calm as they seemed on TV. It was just as up and down in Cheech and Chong's real life as it was in their stoner adventures. What did the two really say to each other when the cameras stopped rolling? You should watch until the end because the truth might shock you. Off stage, they were in a love-hate relationship. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong's friendship was not at all the carefree bromance that fans thought it was based on the famous stoner jokes, unforgettable movie scenes, and roaring laughter that filled theaters. It looked like they were always together on TV. Even though they were both funny, their relationship was tense at times that lasted for almost 20 years. They had creative disagreements and friction that made them laugh together. That's right, the public only saw the finished result, and not the mess that was going on behind the scenes. Why did things go so badly for them if they were such a dream team? If you can get past the weed smoke and laughing, Cheech and Tommy's story slowly starts to answer that question. It turns out that Cheech Marin and Chong were never really best friends in the usual sense. As shown in his autobiography, Cheech said that their bond was more like that of brothers, not necessarily because they loved each other, but because they had been together for a long time and had a strange kind of respect for each other. "I'm your brother," he wrote, "we're not best friends," showing that they had two sides to their relationship. One minute they would fight so badly it was scary, and the next they would do a perfect comedy act like it was nothing. Doesn't that sound like a lot of mental stress? But for them, that was just how their relationship worked. Cheech said that the way they worked together was like how pearls are made. A sore spot inside the shell that, when pressed, changes into something lovely. Could it be the same thing that brought them together and tore them apart that made them famous as comedians? Cheech thought that their chemistry on stage and in movies wasn't always based on deep friendship or respect for each other. It came sometimes anyway. He remembered that they would still be able to act as if nothing had happened, even when there were fights and egos on stage. It might seem like a great skill to be able to separate their personal problems from how they spoke professionally, but it also hinted at the problems that were bubbling just below the surface. Cheech would say later that the way they talked to each other felt like a push and pull. You asked your brother to be quiet sometimes. There were times when you needed him to look out for you. That emotional ups and downs all the time made for great comedy, but it also made for a pretty unstable relationship. What part did ego play in how this fell apart? If you ask both men, it's a pretty big one. One big disagreement was over who should have power over the creative process. Both of them were listed as writers on all 6 of their big movies from 1978 to 1984, but Tommy Chong directed 4 of them. This mismatch wasn't just a small thing for Cheech. He later said it became a very touchy thing. He thought that his own creative efforts were being ignored or given less attention than they deserved. Cheech couldn't ignore the fact that the setup made the power dynamic on set unfair. Even though Chong said it was a strategic choice, the stress got so bad at one point that it showed up on the screen. As shown in a video, Chong told Cheich straight out that he never really deserved to be called a director. "Isn't that a pretty strong accusation? Look at it while it's lying down." He shot back, "That's not true. I directed just as much as you did." For longtime fans, hearing them argue over cred, it may have been shocking or even disappointing, but it was a much more accurate picture of how they worked together. After all, when two creative minds meet and both think they know best, isn't there bound to be some kind of conflict? As their fame grew, so did their problems. Things seemed to change for the worse in the early 1980s, especially while making Nice Dreams in 1981. That's when I saw things getting worse. He says Chong became more controlling and wanted to write everything, direct everything, and make all the important decisions. That made Cheich feel pushed out of a creative process he'd helped build from the start. It wasn't a partnership anymore, it felt more like a one-man show with Cheich as the sidekick. How long could a team last when one person feels invisible? The last straw came in 1985 when they had just released their album Get Out of My Room. Cheich wanted Chong to help record his song Born in East LA, which Kai was really excited about, but Chong refused. Because he didn't want to be a part of it, they ended their 17-year run as a comedy duo. Cheich went ahead and made the song and the movie that went with it on his own, which was a success both critically and commercially. But beneath that success was a deep rift that had finally opened up wide. After many years, Chong looked back with some clarity and maybe a little humility. He accepted that the end of their partnership was probably his fault. He said he'd become a megalomaniac and couldn't let go of the power that came with being a director. "Your words, God," he said, explaining what happens when directors start to believe their own hype. "It's almost tragic, isn't it? The job that let him be creatively free also turned into the thing that made them fight. That doesn't mean they never ran into each other again. Over the years, they got back together a few times, sometimes for tours and sometimes for interviews or films, but their relationship never quite got back to how it was when they were at their best." Cheich even said out loud that there was still a lot of anger between them when they got back in touch. It wasn't like turning on a switch and becoming friends again right away. It takes time to heal, especially if the cuts are from decades ago. Most people still think of Cheech and Chong as the chill stoner duo they are known for, but there's a lot more to their story than just jokes and clouds of smoke. It's true that these two have had successful lives in fields other than comedy, and you might be surprised by what each of them has done. Stay tuned because you won't want to miss the surprise turns their trips took, especially the last part. They have made a lot more than just stoner humor. A lot of people have come to know Cheech and Chong as the king of stoner humor over the years. They were a chill couple whose actions while high on pot made people laugh out loud in theaters and brought cannabis culture into popular culture long before it was cool. But that's not all there is to them. There's a much bigger, more interesting story to tell, because Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong have built careers in show business that go far beyond the bong, hidden behind the smoke and jokes. Their skills have actually taken them to places you might not have thought. Some of them are animation, professional wrestling, political action, and even making serious documentaries. What do Cheech and Chong do when they're not making weed jokes? You might be surprised by the answer. First, let's talk about something simple that is simple to miss: using your voice. Most fans probably don't think of Cheech and Chong when they think of animated movies, but both guys have made very good names for themselves in that field. For example, Cheech Marin's voice is smooth, a little raspy, and full of charm. It's easy to recognize. Disney saw it for sure. Bonsai, the silly hyena in The Lion King, was played by Chi. That movie is one of the most famous animated movies of all time. You may have heard him as Ramon, the low rider with style and attitude, if you've seen any of the Cars movies. That's not all, though. Cheich also did the voice of Stump, a wise talking beetle in Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest, which he shared the screen with Robin Williams' Bat character. Few people would have thought that one of the biggest names in cannabis entertainment would work with the genie, You can bet that Tommy Chong didn't do nothing either. You might not hear his voice as often, but it's just as strong. He made a weird little spot for himself on South Park, the long, running and widely rude animated show. He played a lot of different roles. He played himself. In the episode called Cherokee Hair Tampons, Chong played a made-up version of himself in a plot that made fun of alternative medicine and New Age health trends. It was funny, strange, and very South Park. It also showed that Chong could have fun with himself and still give a good act. Cheech and Chong have played a wide range of characters, from family, friendly ones to snarky ones. This shows how versatile and broad they are in ways that many of their fans may not have thought possible, but motion wasn't the only strange direction they went in. Cheech and Chong went into professional wrestling, which was one of the most unexpected turns in their lives. The famous pair was a guest host on WWE Raw in March 2010, which is the main show for World Wrestling Entertainment. You might be wondering why two pros at pot comedy were on a wrestling show, making noise about their Get It Legal tour, of course. But more than that, they brought the ring their usual wild energy and silly fun. They even did a piece with wrestler Santino Mella, which quickly went from funny to ridiculous when they found marijuana in his herbal tea. As silly as you'd expect, the whole thing, but it also showed how flexible they were. There was always a way for Cheech and Chong to fit in, whether they were in a comedy club, a cartoon studio, or a sports arena. More important part of their story doesn't get as much attention. Tommy Chong and Cheech Marine are no longer just actors. Since then, they've become activists and used their voices in films about health and politics that are more than just funny. One great example is the highly personal documentary, I Tommy Chong, which shows how Tommy was arrested and charged by the U.S. government for selling glass pipes and bongs online. Some people might have just written it off as a famous scandal, but the movie showed how the harmful substance war affected a lot of people and how it was applied unfairly. A lot of people thought the case was stupid and political. This is a clear case of the system punishing someone for who they were, not what they did. Chong showed a serious and reflective side that fans didn't often see on stage when he talked about his experience. What does this all mean when we talk about Chong and Cheech? Simply calling them stoner comedians is not at all what they are about. These artists have changed a lot over the years. They used to do slapstick sketches about smoking joints, but now they make serious points about things like justice, public health, and personal growth. Behind the laughs is a history of coming up with new ideas, being strong, and being honest. And believe us, there's still a lot more to find. Wait until you hear these 5 amazing things you didn't know about Cheech and Chong. You'll want to watch all the way to the end to see the most shocking reveal of all. There are 4 amazing facts about Cheech and Chong that you probably didn't know. To begin, it looked like they were almost in a Friday the 13th movie. Most of the time, people just nod and smile when they talk about famous comedy pairs. But when Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong join the talk, there is a thick cloud of smoke and nostalgia that makes it hard to hear the laughter. Cheech and Chong were more than just funny people. They were a trend in fashion, a stoner revolution in bell-bottoms and bandanas. Yes, their movies were crazy, funny, and silly in the best way possible. What most people don't know, though, is how many weird and impossible things happened behind the scenes while they were public. When you hear these stories, you can't help but wonder how much stranger things could have become. First, let's talk about something really cool. It looked like Cheech and Chong were in a Friday the 13th movie. Really? No. Could you picture that? Picture Jason Voorhees in his hockey mask lumbering through the woods until he comes across 2 chill stoners running a weed farm by chance in the middle of nowhere. Tom McLachlan, who directed Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, actually came up with that idea. After McLachlan's movie brought the slasher genre much, needed new life in 1986, he had an idea that was risky, a little crazy, and kind of clever. He told director Frank Mancuso Jr. about a crossover situation in which Cheech and Chong would go up against Jason and bum around. The plan was for the 2 people to either be running a marijuana business in the woods or be new camp leaders who had no idea what they were doing. No matter what happened, there would have been chaos and laughter. Second, Their joke about the license plate came from a real police officer. You thought you knew everything. That's not the only strange story they have stored. Let's talk about the MOFDVR license plate in Up and Smoke, which is one of their most famous movie scenes. That naughty little thing has become one of the most famous visual jokes in the history of stoner movies, but most fans don't know this little secret. It wasn't Cheech and Chong's idea, not even close, where that plate came from. It belongs to a real police officer. That's right. There was no Hollywood art department that came up with a special muffler plate as a prop. There was a real LAPD officer who owned that vanity plate. Ironically, that officer probably wasn't a big fan of the duo's comedy that was driven by cannabis. This plate has been on a long trip. The adventure began on a plain American Motors Gremlin. Yes, the same type of car that is often the punchline of jokes about cars. The next step was a sleek T-top Corvette, which made it instantly cooler, and the last choice was a modified VW Bug. That Bug would move the plate around until it was finally taken out of service in 1986. You won't believe it, but the first owner still has those plates today. All of them have stickers from the California DMV. This is one of those strange turns of events where the real life is even stranger than the movie. And really, isn't that what Cheech and Chong's legacy is all about? It seems like their whole career was just a bunch of random events, jokes, and fuzzy memories that kept making them famous. Behind the funny voices, the crazy actions, and the smoke clouds, these two made something that was both silly and sneaky. They didn't just push the limits, they locked them up. The strange and wonderful stories about them are made even more interesting by the fact that they almost faced off against one of horror's most famous slashers, or made a police officer's license plate famous in movie history without meaning to. It's funny, but it's also culturally deep. If someone says that comedy is simple or easy, you might want to ask them to look more closely at Cheech and Chong. You see, there's a weird, interesting background behind the jokes and laughs about weed that most people have never heard. And really, doesn't that make watching their movies again even more fun? What other strange secrets are still out there, waiting to come out of the shadows and into the light? Third, Jack Nicholson laughed even though his shoulder was out of place. People have always loved Jack Nicholson's big personality and famous movie career. But even for someone as big as him, there are some stories that make you wonder, did that really happen? One of those stories that will stay with you is about how he reacted to seeing a comedy movie and laughed through pain. As per producer Lou Adler, Nicholson was not in good health when he showed up to see an early showing of the stoner classic, Up in Smoke. Why, he was hurt in a car crash and had to have surgery to fix his shoulder. Yes, a shoulder that isn't in place. Anyone who has ever been hurt, even slightly, knows how hard it is to laugh when you're hurt. If you were Jack Nicholson and you were in a theater, you shouldn't move around too much, and you definitely shouldn't laugh because any laugh, giggle, or chuckle would send sharp shocks through his arm. What about him? Did that stop him from acting? Not at all. Adler was sure that Nicholson had been told not to laugh, even by a doctor, but he just couldn't help himself. When the joke was funny, Nicholson would make these sounds without meaning to grunts, groans, and a chorus of H and OS. Because it hurt to laugh, but he did it anyway. In a strange way, those responses became a kind of gauge for the directors. There was no doubt that a joke was good if it could make someone laugh through pain. His discomfort turned into one of the most honest ways to test the crowd that you could imagine. It's crazy that something so painful could also be so useful. Also, here's an interesting side point. That famous, beat-up Volkswagen Beetle that Tommy Chong drove at the start of the movie, it wasn't just a stunt item from the set. In fact, it was Jack Nicholson's real car. Just picture Jack driving around Los Angeles in that cool little car before it was used in movies. 4. Their nice dream story was 3. 5 pages long. When we talk about Cheech and Chong's way of making movies, did you know that their way of making movies could be just as strange as their comedy? Let's look at their 1981 movie Nice Dreams. The script, if you can even call it that, was said to be only 3.5 pages long. Yes, only 3.5, not 30, not 300, but just enough to get the main idea, some visual clues, and a general idea of where to go. At first, they thought they would play gardeners who were growing marijuana all over Los Angeles in secret. Picture Cheech and Chong cutting back plants during the day and picking buds at night. That idea turned into something even stranger and funnier, though, as many of their projects do, a story about a clown-shaped ice cream truck that sold marijuana. Since the plot wasn't very long, don't think that they just made it up as they went along. It may look like their comedy was a mess on screen, but they were actually very careful with their physical comedy and visual jokes. The storyboards for the whole movie were very detailed. Every time Pratt falls, every chase scene, and every funny part. Everything about them was planned ahead of time. It's pretty cool when you think about it. How is it that a movie that seems so free and wild is actually so well put together? But that's what makes Cheech and Chong so great. Behind the scenes, it wasn't easy at all, but they made it look easy. This is the end of the movie. Thanks for seeing. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to get more. Click on the movie that comes up next to read more exciting stories.